The whip came down so hard it tore through her dress and drew blood in front of the whole street. Her name was Clara Whitfield, and her only crime was being married to a man who owed the wrong man money. Her children watched from the porch, screaming her name. Then a stranger's horse stopped dead in the middle of the road, and a voice said, "Drop it, or I put a bullet through your hand." Silas Pruitt smiled. He had no idea who he was talking to. By nightfall, his whole empire would be in ashes. If you've ever watched someone stand up when everyone else stayed silent, this next story is going to stay with you. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from today, and if Frontier Justice stories keep you coming back, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what happens in Larkspur Hollow. Two of Silas Pruitt's men dragged Clara Whitfield out of her own wagon and into the middle of the street, her wrists bound tight in front of her, her knees hitting the hard-packed dirt before she could even find her footing. The whole town seemed to hold its breath at once, shopkeepers freezing mid-sweep, a farmer's wife pulling her boy back from the window, nobody quite willing to look away, and nobody quite willing to step forward either. Clara kept her chin up despite the dirt already staining the hem of her good dress, despite the fear pounding so hard in her chest she could barely draw a full breath. She had buried her husband 8 months ago, and in all that time, she had never once imagined it would end like this, kneeling in the street in front of the same neighbors who used to wave to her at church. Silas Pruitt stood a few feet back with his arms folded across his chest, watching the whole scene unfold with the calm, satisfied patience of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. He wasn't in any hurry. That was the part that made him so dangerous. The way he could stand there so still while a woman knelt bound in the dirt in front of him, like this was simply business that needed handling before supper. He wanted every person on that street to understand exactly what happened to families who owed him money and didn't pay quickly enough, and he wanted them to understand it without him having to raise his voice even once. Fear worked better when it was quiet, and Silas had built his entire hold over Larkspur Hollow on exactly that kind of quiet fear. Reese Calloway stepped forward with the whip already coiled in his hand, cracking it once hard against the dirt beside Clara's knee, the sound sharp enough to make half the crowd flinch even though nobody had been touched yet. He gave her one last chance, his voice flat and bored, asking if she had anything to say before this started, the same question he'd clearly asked plenty of times before to plenty of other desperate people. Clara said nothing. She simply closed her eyes and waited, her whole body tensing against what was coming. Reese raised the whip high, and it came down hard across her back, tearing straight through the fabric of her dress and drawing a sharp cry from her throat that echoed down the length of the street. Up on the porch of the general store, Clara's 2 children watched every second of it, little Daniel clutching his older sister Mary's hand so tight his knuckles had gone white. Mary was screaming for someone, anyone, to help their mother, her voice cracking with a kind of raw panic no child should ever have to feel, but the crowd around them simply stood frozen, eyes down, hands still, the same way towns like this one always seemed to freeze when Silas Pruitt decided to make an example out of somebody. Daniel buried his face against his sister's side, unable to watch anymore, while Mary kept screaming anyway, refusing to stop even when nobody in that street moved an inch to answer her. That was the exact moment hoofbeats broke through the noise, fast and hard, coming up the road from the east end of town. Jack pulled his horse to a rough stop right at the edge of the crowd, taking in the whole scene in the span of a single heartbeat, Clara bleeding in the dirt, Reese already raising the whip a second time, a whole town standing by and letting it happen. He didn't call out a warning first. He didn't give Silas or Reese a single chance to explain themselves. His hand moved fast, drawing and firing in one smooth motion, the bullet tearing into the dirt an inch from Reese's boot, before the man even fully registered a stranger had arrived at all. Reese jumped back so hard he nearly lost his footing, the whip falling loose in his hand as every head in the street snapped toward the rider now sitting dead still in his saddle, smoke curling from the barrel of his gun. Jack's voice carried flat and even across the sudden silence, telling Reese plainly that the next shot wouldn't land anywhere near his boot if that whip moved so much as an inch closer to that woman. Reese looked to Silas for direction, but Silas hadn't moved at all, studying the stranger with a kind of careful curiosity that had nothing to do with fear. Silas finally spoke, his voice smooth and unbothered, asking who exactly this rider believed he was, riding into Larkspur Hollow and interrupting what he called lawful business being conducted in broad daylight. Every eye in that street turned toward Jack, waiting to hear what kind of man would risk drawing on Silas Pruitt's own enforcer in the middle of his own town. Jack swung down off his horse slow and deliberate, never once taking his eyes off Silas as his boots hit the dirt. He told him plainly that he was the man Tom Whitfield had written to before he died, the letter arriving weeks too late to save him but not too late to bring Jack riding straight into whatever trouble Tom had been too afraid to name outright. For just a fraction of a second, something shifted behind Silas's easy, practiced composure, a flicker of recognition, maybe even something closer to concern, gone almost as fast as it appeared, but not fast enough that Jack missed it entirely. Silas recovered quickly, his smile sliding back into place, but Jack had already seen enough to know that name meant something to this man, something Silas clearly hadn't expected to come walking back into his town. Jack crossed the last few feet of open street without another word, kneeling down beside Clara and pulling a knife from his boot to cut through the ropes binding her wrists, gentle despite the urgency in his movements. Silas watched every second of it in silence, arms still folded, his easy composure now sitting a little too still, a little too careful, like a man quietly working through exactly where he'd heard that name before and what it might mean for everything he'd built in Larkspur Hollow. The whole street stayed dead quiet, waiting to see what Silas Pruitt would do next now that a stranger had ridden straight into the middle of his town and dared to draw first, and as Jack helped Clara to her feet, he could feel Silas's eyes still fixed on him, studying him the way a man studies an old debt he suddenly remembers he never actually paid. Jack helped Clara through her front door and eased her down into a chair near the hearth, working as gently as he could while he cleaned the whip marks across her back with a cloth and warm water Mary had rushed to fetch from the kitchen. Clara winced with every touch but stayed quiet, more concerned with watching her children settle safely into the corner than with the pain still burning across her shoulders. Daniel sat pressed against Mary's side, both of them watching Jack with wide, uncertain eyes, unsure yet whether this stranger who'd ridden in shooting was someone to trust or someone to fear all over again. Jack worked in silence for a while, giving Clara the space to catch her breath, before he finally reached into his coat and pulled out the folded, travel-worn letter that had brought him all this way. He set it gently on the table beside her, explaining that it had arrived weeks after it was written, delayed by weather and bad roads, reaching him long after Tom had already passed. Tom hadn't explained much in it, only that he was in trouble he couldn't talk his way out of, and that if anything happened to him, Jack was the one man he trusted to look after Clara and the children. Clara stared at the letter for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly as she touched the edge of it, recognizing her husband's handwriting even in its hurried, anxious scrawl. She hadn't known he'd written to anyone. She hadn't known he'd been frightened enough to reach out for help from a man she'd never even heard him mention by name before that morning. Slowly, haltingly, Clara told Jack the truth she'd been too ashamed and too afraid to speak out loud to anyone in Larkspur Hollow. Months before he died, Tom had sat down at Silas Pruitt's card table one night, convinced he could win enough to get them through a hard winter, and instead walked away owing a sum of money they never actually had and never could have raised. The debt alone had been crushing enough, but after Tom's death, Silas had quietly added what he called interest, doubling the amount owed within a matter of months, turning an already impossible debt into something that could swallow the entire farm whole. Clara admitted she'd known something was wrong with that table the whole time, some instinct telling her Tom couldn't have lost that badly on his own, but she'd never had any way to prove it, and nobody in town would have believed her over Silas Pruitt's word anyway. Jack sat quiet for a long moment after she finished, staring into the fire, before he finally spoke about a part of his own past he rarely mentioned to anyone. Years ago, before drifting from town to town became his whole life, he'd worked as a card dealer on the riverboats, learning every trick the trade could teach a man willing to bend the rules for a bigger cut. He'd walked away from it for good the night he watched another dealer run a rigged game against an honest rancher, taking the man for everything he owned over a debt that had never actually existed the way the cards claimed it did. The rancher shot himself 2 nights later, unable to face what he thought he owed, and Jack had carried that memory with him ever since, a reminder of exactly how much damage a crooked table could do to people who never stood a fair chance to begin with. He told Clara plainly that if Silas's table was rigged the way he suspected, he wouldn't need more than a single hand to know for certain, because he'd spent years learning every fold, every mark, every subtle trick a dishonest dealer could hide inside a deck or a shuffle. That night, once Clara and the children were settled, and the whip marks were bandaged as well as they could manage, Jack walked back into town alone, and took a seat at Silas's card table, buying into a low-stakes game with just enough money to look like an ordinary drifter passing through with nothing better to do. He watched Silas deal for over an hour, studying every motion of his hands, every pause in his shuffle, until finally he caught it, a barely visible fold pressed into the corner of certain cards, subtle enough to fool nearly anyone, but instantly familiar to a man who'd spent years learning to spot exactly that kind of trick. If you've ever sat across from someone you trusted only to realize later they'd been playing a different game the whole time, drop a comment and tell us about it. Because sometimes the hardest lies to catch aren't the loud ones, they're the quiet ones, dealt out one card at a time, until you don't even realize how much you've already lost. Jack didn't call it out at the table. He folded his hand early, lost a little money on purpose, and let Silas believe exactly what Silas wanted to believe, that he was just another traveler with a little coin and no particular skill worth worrying over. It bought him time, and time was exactly what he needed to figure out how to expose a rigged table in a way that would actually hold up in front of the whole town, rather than simply getting him shot in a saloon that clearly belonged to Silas Pruitt in every way that mattered. As the night wore on and the game finally broke up, Silas leaned back in his chair, studying Jack with the same careful curiosity he'd shown in the street earlier that day, and mentioned almost offhandedly that he'd finally placed where he remembered hearing the name Whitfield mentioned before. Tied to a letter about an old friend from the war, he said it lightly, almost like idle conversation, but there was nothing idle in the way his eyes stayed fixed on Jack while he said it, watching closely for any reaction at all. He added, just as casually, that a man ought to be careful which old debts he decided to go collecting in a town like Larkspur Hollow, the kind of warning dressed up as friendly advice that carried a much sharper edge underneath it. Jack simply nodded, thanked him for the game, and walked out into the cool night air without giving Silas the reaction he'd clearly been fishing for. Walking back toward Clara's farm under a sky full of stars, Jack turned the whole evening over in his mind, piecing together exactly what kind of man he was truly up against. Silas Pruitt wasn't simply a bully who enjoyed cracking a whip in the street to frighten people into paying debts they couldn't afford. He was patient, calculating, the kind of man who noticed things other people missed and remembered names other people forgot, already 2 steps ahead of Jack before their first real conversation had even finished. Exposing a rigged card table wasn't going to be as simple as catching one lucky hand and calling it out in front of a crowd. It was going to take proof solid enough to survive a man clever enough to have already started wondering exactly how much trouble this particular stranger was capable of causing him. The days leading up to the hearing crawled by slower than Clara could bear, every sunrise bringing her closer to the moment a judge would decide whether she kept her farm or lost everything her husband had ever built. She tried to keep busy with chores, tried to keep Mary and Daniel distracted with small tasks around the house, but her hands shook every time she caught sight of the road leading into town, half expecting Silas Pruitt's men to come riding up it again with worse news than before. Jack spent his days working out the details of exactly how he'd expose the rigged table when the time came, but even he could see the toll the waiting was taking on her, the way exhaustion and fear had started carving lines into her face that hadn't been there a week earlier. That was when word arrived from Silas himself, carried by one of his men on horseback, offering what sounded at first like an unexpected kindness. Silas proposed delaying the hearing a full week, giving Clara more time to gather whatever defense she needed, but only on the condition that he be allowed to personally walk the creek frontage on her land, claiming he needed to confirm the exact boundaries before agreeing to any kind of settlement at all. Jack didn't like the sound of it the moment he heard it, warning Clara plainly that a man like Silas never offered anything without expecting something far more valuable in return. But Clara was desperate, worn thin by fear and sleepless nights, and one extra week felt like a lifeline she couldn't afford to refuse, even against Jack's better judgment. Against his warning, she sent word back agreeing to the terms, and 2 days later, while Jack was in town quietly working out how he'd expose the marked cards in front of witnesses who'd actually believe him, Silas rode out to the Whitfield farm alone, just as he'd promised. Clara kept her distance, watching from the porch as he walked the length of the creek slowly, taking notes, measuring distances with a length of rope, appearing every bit as thorough and businesslike as he'd claimed he'd be. She had no way of knowing that while her attention stayed fixed on the water's edge, Silas had already accomplished exactly what he'd truly ridden out there to do, slipping away toward the barn just long enough to bury a small battered strongbox beneath a loose pile of old hay near the back wall. 2 days after that, Silas returned to the farm again, this time with 2 of his own ranch hands trailing behind him as witnesses, making a show of searching the barn under the pretense of confirming property lines mentioned in Tom's old paperwork. It didn't take long before one of his men called out, feigning surprise as he uncovered the very strong box Silas had planted himself, filled with small stolen items easily traced back to a robbery from months earlier that had never been solved. Silas played his part perfectly, expressing shock and disappointment as he examined the contents, telling his men solemnly that it appeared Tom Whitfield hadn't simply lost money at cards, he'd been stealing to cover his losses the whole time. By that evening, a new notice had been delivered to Clara's door, no longer just demanding payment on a debt, but formally accusing her late husband's estate of theft. Jack returned to the farm just after dark to find Clara sitting frozen at the kitchen table, pale and shaking, the notice trembling in her hands as Mary tried uselessly to comfort her, without understanding exactly what was happening. Clara could barely get the words out, explaining through broken breaths what Silas had found, what it meant, how it wasn't just about a card game debt anymore. This new charge gave Silas legal grounds to seize the entire farm outright, and worse, it had moved the hearing up instead of delaying it, pushing everything forward to just 2 days from now, instead of the extra week Silas had originally promised. Jack read the notice twice, his jaw tightening with every line, understanding immediately that Silas had never intended to give them more time at all. He'd simply needed one afternoon alone on that property to build an entirely new lie, one far harder to disprove than a rigged deck of cards. If you've ever trusted someone's promise only to realize too late it was never a kindness at all, but a trap dressed up to look like one, drop a comment below and tell us, because sometimes the cruelest lies are the ones wrapped in an offer that looks like mercy. Jack sat with Clara long enough to calm her breathing and steady her hands, promising her they weren't beaten yet, even as his own mind raced through everything that had just changed. Proving a card table was rigged had been difficult enough on its own. Proving a dead man never stole anything, against a strong box that had supposedly sat hidden in that barn for months, was going to require something far stronger than a marked deck laid out on a table in front of a judge. Once Clara and the children were finally settled for the night, Jack saddled his horse again and rode back out to the barn alone, lantern in hand, determined to examine that strong box and the ground around it for himself before Silas's version of events hardened into accepted truth. He knelt in the hay where his men had claimed to find it, running his fingers carefully through the disturbed dirt beneath, and noticed something that didn't sit right the moment he saw it. The soil around where the box had supposedly rested for months was loose and freshly turned, dark and damp in a way that old, undisturbed dirt simply never looked, nothing like the packed, settled ground surrounding it that hadn't been touched in years. Whoever buried that strong box hadn't done it months ago the way Silas claimed. They'd done it recently, likely within the very week Silas himself had walked this exact stretch of land alone. Jack sat back on his heels in the dim lantern light, turning the discovery over carefully in his mind, understanding now that he wasn't just fighting one lie anymore, he was fighting two, stacked one on top of the other, each one designed to look ironclad enough to survive a judge's scrutiny. A rigged card table was hard enough to prove without solid physical evidence sitting right in front of a courtroom. A planted strongbox with fresh dirt disturbed around it was a start. But fresh dirt alone wouldn't be enough to convince a skeptical judge that Silas Pruitt himself had done the planting, not without someone willing to say so out loud. With only 2 days left before Larkspur Hollow's hearing decided Clara's fate for good, Jack rode back toward the farm under a moonless sky, fully aware now that whatever he built to bring into that courtroom, it needed to be strong enough to unravel both lies at once, because Silas Pruitt wasn't going to give him a second chance to catch him unprepared again. The morning of the hearing, Larkspur Hollow's small courthouse filled past capacity. Farmers and shopkeepers packed shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, every seat taken well before the judge even arrived to take his place at the bench. Silas Pruitt sat calm and composed beside his lawyer at the front table, dressed sharper than usual, his confidence radiating off him like heat off a summer road. He had every reason to feel certain of himself. A dead man couldn't defend against a theft charge, and a grieving widow with 2 children had no way to fight a strongbox found on her own property in front of witnesses. As far as Silas was concerned, this hearing was already finished before it began. Clara sat near the front with Mary and Daniel pressed close on either side of her, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking in front of the whole town. Jack sat beside her, calm in a way that didn't match the nervous energy filling every other face in that room, his coat pocket weighed down with the worn deck of cards he'd carried through every riverboat game he'd ever dealt. When the judge finally called the hearing to order and asked if either side had anything to present before a ruling was made, Jack stood and requested permission to demonstrate something to the court, something he believed the judge needed to see before deciding anything about debts or theft or the Whitfield land at all. The judge, curious despite himself, allowed it. And Jack walked to the front of the room, laying Silas's own deck of cards flat across the table where the whole courtroom could see them clearly. He explained plainly what he'd once done for a living, years spent dealing cards on riverboats up and down the territory, learning every trick a dishonest dealer could hide inside a deck or a shuffle. Then, one card at a time, he showed the judge and the crowd the faint, deliberate folds pressed into specific corners, marks so subtle most men would never notice them across a lifetime of playing, but unmistakable to anyone who'd spent years learning exactly what to look for. He dealt out hand after hand exactly the way Silas always dealt, showing the room how those marks let a dealer know precisely what sat in every player's hand before a single card was ever turned face up. A heavy, uncomfortable silence spread through the courtroom as Jack laid it all out clearly, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that no man had ever truly won or lost fairly at that table. Not once, not ever. Silas's lawyer tried to object, calling it nothing more than a stranger's clever party trick, but the judge waved him quiet, leaning forward now, with real interest, real suspicion finally settling behind his eyes as he studied the marked cards for himself. Silas sat rigid beside his lawyer, his easy composure cracking for the first time since Jack had ridden into town, his jaw tightening as he realized exactly how much damage one deck of cards was doing to everything he'd built. Near the back of the room, Reese Calloway had gone pale, sweat beading along his collar despite the cool morning air drifting through the open windows. He knew what was coming next before Jack even turned toward that part of the story, because Reese was the one who'd carried that strongbox out to the Whitfield barn himself, following orders exactly as he'd been told. Jack turned from the cards to the theft charge next, describing the fresh, disturbed dirt he'd found around where the box had supposedly rested undiscovered for months. Details specific enough that only someone who'd actually stood in that barn on the day it was planted could possibly have known them. Reese's hands trembled in his lap, his eyes darting towards Silas, searching for some sign of what to do, some quiet signal that everything would still be fine if he simply stayed silent a little longer. But something in Reese finally broke under the weight of it all, watching Jack lay out proof after proof in front of the entire town he'd grown up in. Rather than hang alongside a rich man's scheme he'd never truly believed in, Reese stood up from his seat near the back, his voice shaking as he addressed the judge directly, admitting in front of everyone that Silas had ordered him to plant that strongbox himself, admitting the theft charge had been invented from nothing but Silas's own desperation to seize the Whitfield land once and for all. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as neighbors turned to stare at Silas, whose face had gone white with a fury he could no longer hide behind practiced calm. The judge slammed his gavel down hard, furious at having nearly been used to legitimize a fraud built on a dead man's stolen reputation, and declared both the gambling debt and the theft charge void immediately, striking every claim Silas Pruitt ever held against Clara Whitfield's land or her husband's name. Deputies moved in fast, placing Silas in handcuffs right there in front of the same town he'd spent years ruling through fear and quiet threats, his empire unraveling completely in the space of one single afternoon. Nobody in that courtroom stepped forward to defend him, not his lawyer, not his ranch hands, not a single soul who'd once been too afraid to speak against him. As deputies led him out through the courthouse doors, Silas passed within a few feet of Jack, and for just a moment their eyes met, Silas finally understanding exactly what kind of man had walked into his town that day, and exactly how badly he'd underestimated him. Outside the courthouse, the whole town seemed to breathe easier under the open sky, neighbors approaching Clara one after another, offering apologies for their silence, offering help rebuilding whatever Silas's schemes had cost her family over the past year. Thank you for spending this time with us today, and we'll see you in the next story.